This is it. What came out. Weighs about 10 pounds. And it's a culmination, like I said, of years of work. I'm going to go over some of what you've heard here. By the way, that the narrator on that was John Stolp, who's the special water advisor to Governor Hickenlooper. He's got a great voiceover voice. I figure he's probably should be the next Coors spokesman. I'll give you a little bit of background on this process. This really started back in 2004 with something called SWASI, which was the Statewide Water Supply Initiative. It was a study undertaken by the state through the Colorado Water Conservation Board, or CWCB, who's in charge of water policy, administering water policy for the state of Colorado. And that study started looking on a statewide basis at demands and supplies for the first time. Where that was done. Otherwise, generally this type of thing had been only done on an individual water provider basis. You know, Aurora's been doing its own planning, Denver does its own planning and all, but we really haven't had the opportunity to collaborate with ourselves, between ourselves as well as with entities throughout the state, including the Western Slope. Then in 2005, though, an act was created called the Colorado Water for the 21st Century Act by the House of Representatives. And that established a program whereby there was what's called an IBCC, or an Interbasin Compact Committee, that has 27 members, representative from all across the state, and then also eight basin roundtables that were set up that. Plus, actually, there were 9 because they took the metro area, Metro Denver area, which is actually in the South Platte Basin, if you think about it geographically. It's, you know, we drain to the South Platte River here, but the metro area is so different than the rest of the South Platte Basin, which is primarily rural, that they set up a separate basin roundtable just for them. So that work has been going on since 2005, and when John talks about thousands of meetings, that these are the meetings that he's referring to. That these have been meeting monthly for over 10 years now throughout the state. SWASI itself was updated again in 2010, and then in 2013 was Governor Hickenlooper's executive order that you heard him mention, where he basically set in motion that, okay, now we've been discussing this for 10 years, let's start looking at solutions and developing a plan to go towards those solutions. So a number of things have been happening during that process. One of them is each of these basin roundtables created their own basin implementation plans, and these plans then looked at what our own needs were within each basin, as well as our supplies and what our goals were and how to meet those demands for all of those future needs. Then a draft water plan actually came out in about 1 year, in December of 2014. Another draft in 15, and then finally this final plan that I showed you here, it came out on November 19th with a lot of fanfare just last year. But it's, as you heard there, it's a dynamic plan. It's going to keep moving and keep progressing. So they're already on a schedule. They're looking at doing another one of these SWASI updates, looking again at updating all this information. The plan itself will be updated again in 2020. SWASI will be updated again. There's basically a 5 or 6 year cycle here that's going to basically need to go on forever until either we stop growing or we don't need water anymore. So I'm not sure when that will happen, but it's probably not in any of our lifetimes. So Aurora's been involved throughout this process. We're members of the IBCC since inception. Some of my predecessors were members. I've been a member for the last 4 years, and I sit on that board and go to all those meetings and work there with my counterparts throughout the state. We're also members of the Metro Roundtable. You know, presently the one that sits there and represents actually Aurora, but as well as all of Arapahoe County, the municipal water providers of Arapahoe County. And then Aurora is somewhat unique in that we get our water not only from the South Platte where we live. About half of our water supply comes from there, but another 25% comes out of the Colorado River Basin, and then another 25% comes out of the Arkansas River Basin. So each of those have roundtables, and we sit on those too, not as voting members, but we play an active role in those too, because what happens there obviously affects us. Throughout this process, as these plans come out, we've provided comments. Those have come from staff that we've prepared those. City Council has provided comments back to the state on all the different drafts, and actually even right through the final version, a final comment letter was sent by our City Council to the governor based on the final plan. Talk just a little bit about what's in the plan, what the major highlights are. What they have identified in there, what they call measurable objectives. And I'm going to just show a few of these here. There's a number of them. But one of them is, you heard them talk about a gap. A gap is where there's a difference between supply and demand. And you can realize that it's a very hard number to pin down, because when you're looking at what our demand is going to be by 2050, it's going to be a matter of what's our population look like in the state, how are people going to be using their water, that changes over time, and economic conditions will affect that. So the number that they've landed on is a potential projection is anywhere from 310,000 acre feet up to 560,000 acre feet by 2050 is what they're projecting. Could be a difference between supply and demand. I realize we use terms like acre feet and throw them out to give you some idea of what an acre, what those are. An acre foot, one way of looking at it, well, the mathematical way is if you have an acre of land and the water on it's 1 foot deep, that would be an acre foot of water. But what that really means is if you're thinking about a normal single family home with 2.6 people per home, which is a kind of an average, and a lawn that they water and a garden, used to be that a home like that would use 1 acre foot a year. That number has been steadily dropping as people practice conservation and use their water differently. And it's now it's under 0.5 acre feet. So an acre foot can supply 2 homes. So if you're talking about 560,000 acre feet, doing the math, that's over 1.1 million homes, not just people, but 1.1 million homes that there wouldn't be a water supply for based on this gap. So they want to reduce that number and actually get it to 0 is the objective of the plan. They say get it to 0 by 2030. What we want to do is have a plan in place, have projects identified and projects in motion so that by 2030 we know how we're going to do this, and the solutions would be in place and implemented by 2050 to eliminate that gap. Another thing, that a big part of this is they want to look at water conservation as a goal of helping to reduce that gap. They have a target in there, they call it an aspirational goal of 400,000 acre feet, and that's a huge number. And actually that isn't all going to help reduce the gap, because a lot of that water gets used for other purposes, not just meeting that gap, so maybe half of it might go towards the gap. And whether or not that's achievable is still something that's being explored. And is that a realistic number? Because frankly, everybody's done such a fantastic job of conservation. The big question is how much more can we squeeze out of that? Since when you look back at 2003, or just before the 2003 drought, 2002 to 2003 drought, since that time, Aurora's population has grown by about 25% in that period of time. Our water use, basically our average use per person, has dropped by 32% in that same period. So overall, we're supplying about the same amount of water we did back in 2002 for 25% more people. So we've done, and that's all because it's credit to our customers and the conservation program we have in place. They've done such a great job of reducing their use through landscaping, through using less water for irrigation, more efficient irrigation systems, efficient appliances in their houses, low-flow toilets, all of those things. That's all contributed to it. But you wonder how much more you can do. And we still think we can do quite a bit more, but the jury's out on just how far that can go. They have other goals in here. The one that's going to affect us probably from the legislative side is by 2025 they want 75% of Coloradans living in communities that have incorporated water-saving actions into land use planning. And what that means is that the land use planning has to, and land use controls are they want to be defined as that would incorporate water saving and not just make it something that you should do or want to do, but something you have to do. So that could be, for that type of thing to happen, it's probably going to happen through the legislative process, and it's going to have to be a collaborative process across both local and state delegations. Another big objective they have is to add another 400,000 acre-feet of storage in Colorado. That's a doable thing. Aurora itself has a number of storage projects. You're going to hear about one of them in a little bit that we're planning for the future. But it's a goal that we've recognized that in order to manage the supplies that we have, you really need storage to do that, because supplies don't show up at the same time demands do. And so to meet that balance, and also the balance over dry years and droughts, the only way to handle that is through storage. Of course, with all of this, the projects that they've identified and the measures, the goals, they've actually estimated the cost of implementing this plan at over $20 billion. Frankly, I think that number's low. I don't think it's factored into everything yet. One of the things that they've recognized is that probably $16 billion of that is going to be done by the water providers like Aurora Water. And frankly, that's not a surprise, because we have always, water providers develop their own supplies, develop it through, and they cover the costs through, our customers pay for those costs through rates and fees. You're going to hear more about that too in a little bit. But we've always operated that way, and we don't expect it to be any different. There's nobody out there that's going to help us get our supplies. We have to do this ourselves and make sure that we're meeting the current and future needs of our customers. But there's still going to be a shortfall even with that. So they're looking at different ways of raising revenue in the state, and that's going to translate into some very uncomfortable topics for people, because how do you do that? You're going to be doing it through other types of fees, through taxes, through reallocating funds from somewhere else, through things like bottle deposit fees that might come in. Those types of things are probably going to have to, they're going to be discussed in the legislature, but a lot of that's probably going to come out to statewide votes on whether they would approve those things. And frankly, Colorado hasn't been very successful in the past on those types of issues to be able to fund water projects. So it's a tough conversation, but you can have the greatest plan in the world, but if you can't implement it because you don't have the funds, it doesn't do you very much good. So it's a problem that has to be solved. This, I'll just go through very quickly. It's actually an outline of the plan. I'll give you a website where you can go look at it yourself if you're interested in any part of it. But there's different sections through it, throughout. They actually lay a very good framework, just even if you're not interested in how we're going to solve things, that if you just are interested in the water topic, and when we're talking about supply and demand, what does that mean? If you read through these first 5 chapters, you'll get a very good feel for that. The meat of the plan, though, is this chapter 6. That's the one where we lay out, here's different options and alternatives we could be looking at. And it's using a number of different strategies, such as scenario planning, that looks at a lot of possible different futures and tries to find alternatives that can then work under multiple futures as opposed to just one particular future. Looks at ways of meeting those gaps that we've identified. And there's a big focus on water conservation and reuse. Another big piece of this, fundamental point or objective in the plan is to protect Colorado's heritage and its agriculture. And the states recognize the importance of our agriculture, not to just only feed the citizens, but it's a big part of our economy. Our agriculture gets exported to other states. We feed other states, other countries. And it's an important part of our heritage that we don't want to lose. And frankly, a lot of it does get lost as urban development happens. I mean, when a city keeps spreading out, this area we're sitting in now used to be farmland, and it's no longer farmland. It's now a community college that's been converted over, and that happens throughout the state. So that land gets lost through that. It's also a place where you could look for supply. I think you heard one of the things that John mentioned was And when you start looking at supply and demand, the supply in the state of Colorado, what creates a problem for the state of Colorado is about 80% of our supply is in the western slope in the Colorado River Basin. And 80% of the population in Colorado, the people that are using that water, are in the eastern slope. We can see that that creates a real problem right there. There's an imbalance we're dealing with. But at the same time, of course, we like to have the water on the western slope because that's a lot of the reason why we're here, because we like to recreate there, we like the environmental benefits of it. And so we don't want to lose that either. But another piece of it was with the agriculture that you have to look at is agriculture actually, of all the water that's used in Colorado, consumed, physically taken out of the system, about 80% of it's used for agriculture. Municipal and industrial use, basically what people like Aurora use and Denver uses in Colorado Springs, we use about 10 to 15% of that supply. So when you're looking at what, obviously if you're looking at supply and demand or any type of market analysis, the supply is out there in agriculture, that's where you can get the water, and the need is in the municipal, and that's where you can go for it, so that's another place that creates that imbalance. So one of the things, though, that we looked at is how can we be creative and keep more water in agriculture, try to slow down this process. You may have heard the term buy and dry, and that's where you go out and you buy a farmer's water rights, he sells them to a city, and then because you can't, when you do that, you can't harm other water right owners, so he can't keep on using that water because now he sold it, so that land has to dry up, and so that's what's called buy and dry. Aurora's been involved in some of that. We've done, that's part of our portfolio. We've always done it where we've had farmers coming to us and they want to sell us their water. One of the things you have to realize in Colorado with our complicated water right system is water rights are a property right. They own that water. They bought it, developed it themselves, so they have a right to sell it. It's just like a house or a piece of land. So they don't want people telling them, well, you can't sell that anymore. For many of these farmers, that's their 401k, and that's what they're going to retire on. If their children aren't going to take the farm or they're not going to be able to sell the farm to someone else who wants to keep farming. So you have to respect those rights too. You can't take that away from them. But we're looking at different ways of trying to stem that flow of water coming over to municipal or taking it out permanently, and we're doing something called ATMs. It's not a cash machine. It's an alternative agricultural transfer. It's a way of actually using that, taking that water, but still allowing it to stay in farming, looking at improving irrigation methods and other ways of doing that. Aurora is actually one of the leaders in the state on doing that. We've been doing this since 2003. We've leased water down in the Arkansas Valley, where we had temporary leases and only used the water during droughts, and the rest of the time it went back into farming. So the farmers, in the years that they were losing, they weren't producing, so they weren't getting that revenue. Instead, they were getting revenue from payments from Aurora, so they could stay afloat and still make their loan payments and do whatever they wanted to do during those years, but then they could come back into farming again when we didn't need the water. We've also done, we have what's called a continued farming program down in the Arkansas Valley, down in Rocky Ford area, where we've helped them install new irrigation systems, improve their operations so that they can produce more value off their land with less water. And then we've been able to keep the difference. And by paying for that for them, we've kept them in operation. We've also added to our supply. So those ATMs are one way of we're looking at doing that. Another thing is M&I and ag infrastructure projects and methods. You may have seen on some of the slides or heard someone talk about IP&Ps. They're identified projects and processes. Those are basically projects that are already planned. You'll hear about one of them here in a bit. Reservoir. Aurora has a number of these. The plan has recognized that water providers have plans in place. So do agricultural interests, so do environmental interests. Those plans are in place, and we're assuming that they're going to get built, and they need to. Matter of fact, if they don't get built, that 560,000 acre-foot gap is going to get bigger. It assumes actually that we're going to be 80% successful in all of those projects. That doesn't mean 8 out of 10 get built and 2 get sent to the scrapyard. What it means is that we would get basically whatever you're projecting you're going to get out of those projects, you're going to achieve at least 80% of that supply out of those projects. So trying to be conservative in that. So we have those, and so do others, and those need to be completed in order for this plan to be effective. The other thing he mentioned was about the west slope to east slope transfer. There is a concept out there. It's called the conceptual framework. That's a way of allowing the east slope and west slope to continue a dialogue to say, how could water still, new trans mountain diversions be taken over? They could be interruptible supplies. They could have a lot of caveats attached to them, but they would be a way of achieving some more supply, getting more supply to the Front Range. Frankly, Colorado River, even though we have to send a lot of it downstream, under our compact, Colorado hasn't developed all of its supply, and we want to be able to protect that right. And that supply can be used anywhere in the state, according to that compact, and we don't want to lose that ability. And where the obvious need is on the Front Range, but there's west slope needs for that too. So we have a dialogue in place for our framework for the dialogue to take place for that to keep looking for options. It used to be that, the adage was not one more drop or not in my backyard. NIMBY, you may have heard that. People don't want, the West Slope did not want these projects. And there's still a very strong faction that doesn't, but at least the plan has developed a framework that says, here's how we can continue to explore this, and we don't want to close that door and close off that opportunity forever. So that was just a quick overview of it. Tell you what's next in it, from the legislature side. It's already started. There's been some discussion of different bills out there, looking at these discussions that the legislatures had didn't just start because of the water plan. There's things like we were just talking about the rain barrel bill. That's finally getting passed this year. It's been talked about for years, and it allows the residents, any home, a single-family home, to have up to 2 rain barrels, 2 55-gallon rain barrels, to use to divert water basically off their rooftops and put it on their lawns or their gardens. So that's going to be passed and allowed. Colorado was the last state that wasn't allowing that, frankly, and now it will be. There's other discussions that have been out there that have started. They haven't been finalized. Things looking at, there was one controversial bill called the water loss audit bill this year that was postponed indefinitely, but I think it's going to be discussed over the summer, and it'll probably come back again next year. But it's looking at means of reducing losses in systems, municipal systems, to help additionally conserve water. There's going to be discussions, there already have been discussions on land use policy, saying, here's what you can use water for, certain types of water, limiting it for how much you can use on lawns or how much you can use for different purposes. Those haven't gone anywhere. It gets very sticky because we're dealing with, Colorado's very much a local control state. The individual cities want to have control over what they can and can't do. And so when you have the legislature trying to tell you what you can and can't do, it creates some interesting conversations. And there'll be many more of those, I'm sure. So we'll be seeing more and more of those go along. Aurora's actively engaged in those discussions through various committees and tracking, monitoring legislation. CWCB, the Colorado agency, is going to continue working on SWASI, continue working on updates to the water plan. That's going on right now. Our IBCC committee is still continuing to meet. One of the tasks we're going to be looking at is exploring more of these funding options of how we could look at raising the revenues or reallocating revenues in order to implement this plan. The Basin Roundtables are looking at implementing their own plans. So this work is going to continue, and it really, I don't think there's no end in sight to it because things change. Our demands will change, our population will grow, and frankly, our supply changes. Everybody, you can argue whether it's climate change or whatever it is, but I think everyone's seeing that there's more extreme events happening. We're getting drier droughts and wetter floods and hotter summers and not necessarily colder winters, but it's changed over time. And even what we used to see, what we thought was a pretty static history, that things didn't change 50 years ago, well, now we're seeing, no, they are changing. And for whatever reason, we don't have to argue about why it is, but we have to figure out how to deal with it if it is happening. So we're looking at all of that. And Aurora is involved in all of this. We're continuing to participate in all of these activities, and we'll continue to do that. So with that, that's the end of this summary. If you look here on the website, coloradowaterplan.com, if you go up to that, I probably don't want to try it tonight because I actually tried it before I came here. The state's website has been down for 2 days. I don't know what's going on, if they've been hacked or something's happened, but you can't get on the site right now. But normally it's all there. You can go and you can look at this plan, you can read it online, you can download it and print it. There's links, you can look at the basin implementation plans, you can read the 30,000 comments if you're really interested in it. And there actually are 30,000 comments out there. And some of them are form letters, but there's a lot of individually written comments, and that wasn't just the city of Aurora writing these. We're responsible for maybe a dozen of those, but not 30,000. So I'd welcome you to take a look at that, and also give Aurora Water a call if you have any questions about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marshall. I think, do we want to do questions at the end of the whole thing, or how would you like to do that? Why don't we just go on?
Okay, so you heard about what's going on statewide. I'm going to talk a little more about Aurora specifically. You heard a concept earlier from Representative Wright about an enterprise fund. The state has a few enterprises. Aurora Water is an enterprise, which means we don't get funding from any other source other than what we create ourselves. So most of our revenue comes from two places. What are called connection fees, which most of you don't see when a developer builds something, whether it's a single-family residential home or a business. They hook up to the system. They need to get a meter for us to bill them. We bill the developers right up front what's called a connection fee. Connection fees can be anywhere in the range of $20,000 per connection up to millions of dollars per connection, depending on how much water that development will use. The second source of revenue you see, almost everybody in here probably gets a water bill. That's our second source of revenue, or what we call rates. We'll talk a little more about water rates and what is on your bill. Our third source of revenue is much smaller. It's special agreements. So we don't get any funding from taxes. We don't get any funding from the state. We're self-funded, and so that's one of the reasons we send water bills out. Our costs for a water utility are primarily fixed. About 70% of our costs don't change from year to year. Our revenue is highly variable depending upon how much water you all use. That dictates how much revenue we collect. We're also one of the few commodities. Most people who sell a commodity don't encourage the customers not to buy the commodity. We actually encourage you not to buy as much of the water as possible. We encourage water conservation. So that presents some unique challenges for us. Again, how do we encourage water conservation yet still generate enough revenue to cover what our fixed costs? So that's a little bit unique to our industry. We think we do a pretty good job providing a high value of what we sell. It costs about half a cent per gallon of water that we deliver to your home. Compare that with milk, bottled water in the store, gasoline, any other commodity out there. And water is relatively inexpensive, even though in Colorado it's the projects, the magnitude and the cost of the projects we deal with is fairly large. But we're still able to deliver a product to the home at a very reasonable cost. Aurora, a lot of people in Aurora think Aurora has one of the higher water bills in the state. In actuality, we do not. So Aurora is in the lower third of water bills in the state of Colorado. This is a comparison. Now it's a little, depending on how you present the data, it can be a little bit misleading. Denver is at the bottom. Denver, as a utility, has the largest number of customers. So if you look at it on a water provider basis, you see that Aurora Water, again, is in the lower third. We're very competitive on our rates throughout the state compared to other water providers. Denver does, if you look at this data on a per customer basis, it's skewed a little bit because Denver has the largest number of customers and they do have the lowest rates. So a water bill, there's a few things that show up on your water bill when you get it at your home. The largest components are related to water, but Aurora Water, actually, we